Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be doing a deep dive on something I think a lot of people think they know, the Battle of Jericho. We've got a lot of really cool sources to look at. We're going to be looking at this story in the Bible itself, both in the King James Version and the New International Version. And then we've got a couple articles here, one called 7 Powerful Lessons from the Fall of the Walls of Jericho. That's a topical study. And then we've got another article called, What is the Significance of the Battle of Jericho? We're going to try to take this beyond just the Sunday school version and really kind of dig deeper into what happened at Jericho. Why is this story so significant, and what can we learn from it even today?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting you use the word complexities because that's what often gets overlooked with the story. People tend to fixate on this really dramatic picture of walls crumbling, but there's a lot more to it than that. The story of Jericho, it raises questions about how do we interpret divine intervention? What about the ethics of warfare in the Bible? And really the nature of God's interaction with humanity. So,
There's a lot there. Okay, so let's set the stage here. We're talking about the Israelites, fresh out of Egypt after 400 years, finally about to enter the Promised Land. But standing in their way is this seemingly insurmountable obstacle, Jericho. So how formidable of a city are we talking about here?
So Jericho wasn't just some tiny little village. It was a strategically vital city. It was heavily fortified, and it was considered basically impenetrable. You know, if you look at archaeological evidence, what they found is it had these massive walls, intricate gate systems, and just a very sophisticated defense structure. So imagine the Israelites, a people who've just escaped slavery, not exactly seasoned warriors. Standing before this, the odds were definitely stacked against them.
So what do? They just
Yeah.
launch a full frontal assault. They've got whatever makeshift weapons they can put together.
Not quite. This is where the story takes a pretty fascinating turn. God, through Joshua, gives them a very, very unusual battle plan. So they're instructed to march around the city once a day for 6 days. Priests are blowing trumpets. They're carrying the Ark of the Covenant. And then on the 7th day, they circle the city 7 times, blow the trumpets, shout, and then see what happens.
I mean, you've got to wonder what's going through their minds at this point. Do they think this is some kind of practical joke? Was there any kind of historical precedent for this kind of military strategy?
That's something that's debated a lot. Some scholars have pointed to possible psychological warfare tactics that were used in ancient times. Others suggest that it was more of a symbolic act, demonstrating the Israelites' complete reliance on God. But whatever the interpretation, it definitely goes against any conventional military wisdom. And so it really raises a big question. What does it mean to trust in God's plan when it seems totally illogical or even absurd?
I think that tension between faith and reason is something a lot of people can relate to. We're told to have faith. But then what happens when what we're asked to believe seems completely at odds with our understanding of the world?
Yeah, that's really the heart of the Jericho story. It challenges us to consider what it actually means to surrender to something beyond our comprehension. And let's not forget, the Israelites had just witnessed plagues, the parting of the Red Sea. You'd think, after all, that trusting God would be a little easier.
Maybe. But humans are complex. Even after seeing miracles, doubt can creep in. So what happens next? Do the walls actually crumble?
Well, the biblical account says that they did. So imagine this. 6 days of silent marching, the tension building with every single lap around the city. Then on the 7th day, 7th time around, the trumpets blast, the people shout, and the walls come crashing down. Jericho falls to the Israelites. It's a really dramatic moment of victory. But it's important to ask ourselves, was it purely divine intervention, or was there something more going on?
And that's where the different interpretations come in, right?
Absolutely.
People have wrestled with how literally to understand this event.
Absolutely. And that's a good thing. Faith isn't about blind acceptance. It's about really engaging with the text, asking those tough questions, and searching for a deeper understanding.
So let's dive into some of those questions then. One thing that jumps out is this idea of divine intervention. The victory at Jericho is attributed to God's power. But how do we reconcile that with the violence that's depicted in the story?
That is a really important question. And it's crucial to remember that the Bible was written in a specific time and place, a specific historical and cultural context, where warfare was just a common reality. But even within that context, we have to wrestle with the ethical implications. How do we understand God's involvement in human conflicts? How do we interpret the idea of a holy war? These are tough questions that theologians have grappled with for centuries, and they're just as relevant today as they've ever been.
It seems like people get so hung up on trying to find like a simple black and white answer, but maybe there isn't one. It's about really wrestling with those complexities. and recognizing that our understanding of God is always evolving.
I think you've got it. And that's what makes the story of Jericho so powerful. It doesn't give us easy answers, but it does invite us to participate in a deeper conversation about faith, about obedience, and about God's interaction with humanity.
So beyond the dramatic battle itself, there's these deeper layers of meaning to uncover. But before we go there, there's one character whose story we can't skip over, Rahab. She's a fascinating figure in the story, and she plays a very pivotal role in the events of Jericho.
Oh, absolutely. Her story adds a completely new dimension to our understanding of faith in God's grace.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the Battle of Jericho. Before the break, we were just about to explore the story of Rahab. Now, she wasn't just some ordinary citizen of Jericho.
That's for sure. Rahab was a prostitute, someone who was kind of relegated to the fringes of society. And yet her story is woven into this incredible event. It really challenges our assumptions about who God chooses to use.
It's a good reminder that God often works in ways that we least expect. He uses the things that we might consider insignificant or overlook to accomplish his plan. So how does Rahab come into the picture?
Well, before the Israelites actually attack Jericho, Joshua sends 2 spies into the city to gather some intel, and they end up finding refuge in Rahab's house, which is kind of a risky move. I mean, she's harboring the enemies of her people.
Yeah, talk about a leap of faith, both for the spies and for Rahab.
Yeah.
What do you think would have motivated her to take such a risk?
Well, Rahab had heard the stories about the God of Israel, his power over nature, how he delivered the Israelites from Egypt, and it seems like she had developed a belief, a trust in this God, even though he wasn't her God. It's an incredible example of how faith can spring up in the most unexpected places.
It's interesting that even before seeing Jericho fall, she was already convinced of their God. So she decides to help these spies. What happens next?
Well, she has to hide them on her roof when the king's men come looking for them. And then she ends up helping them escape by lowering them down the city wall with this scarlet cord. It's a small detail, but it comes back later.
It's like a spy movie. Daring escape, intrigue, suspense. But it's more than just an adventure story. What's the deeper significance of her actions?
Well, her choice to help the spies shows a lot of courage. She recognizes the power of the God of Israel, and she chooses to align herself with him. Even though it means going against her own people, it's a powerful picture of someone stepping out in faith even when there's a lot of personal risk involved.
Makes you think about what were the walls in her own life that needed to come down?
Yeah,
What were the obstacles she had to overcome to make that decision?
that's a really good point. It suggests that her act of faith wasn't just about survival. It was about choosing a new path, a new way of life. And it's a really great symbol of the power of faith to transform someone.
And she gets rewarded for her faith, right? What happens to Rahab when Jericho falls?
Well, Joshua instructs the Israelites to spare her and her family. They're rescued from the destruction because of her faith and her obedience. It's a reminder of God's mercy and his willingness to show grace to everyone who turns to him, even those from really unexpected backgrounds.
It's a powerful reminder that God's grace is for everyone, no matter their past or their social standing. But there's another twist to her story, one that connects her to an even bigger story.
Oh, yeah. This is where it gets really interesting. The book of Matthew traces the genealogy of Jesus. And guess who shows up in that lineage?
No way.
Really?
Rahab. That's incredible. So this woman, who was once an outcast, a prostitute living in a city that was condemned, she becomes an ancestor of Jesus.
It's pretty amazing, and it speaks volumes about God's power to redeem and the way he includes people in his plan. It really challenges our ideas about who's worthy of God's favor.
Yeah, it really emphasizes that God can use anybody for his purposes, even people that society might think are unfit. It's a message that speaks to us even today as we're figuring out issues like inclusion and acceptance.
Absolutely. And it goes back to what we were talking about before with God's plan and how complex it is. Rahab's story is proof that God often works in ways we just don't expect. He sees beyond what's on the outside and into people's hearts.
Her story adds a whole other layer to what it means to be redeemed. It's not just about avoiding physical destruction. It's about being rescued from a life that's separated from God.
Exactly. And that's a theme that we see throughout the Bible, and it ultimately leads to the final redemption through Jesus.
Rahab's story is truly amazing, but there's still more to unpack about the Battle of Jericho. When we come back, we'll dig into the aftermath of the battle, the lessons we can learn, and how it all fits into the bigger story of the Bible. We're back and ready to talk about what happened after the Battle of Jericho. Now, you might think that after such a crazy victory, it was all smooth sailing from there for the Israelites.
Oh man, I wish. But the fall of Jericho was just the beginning of a much longer campaign. Remember, they were entering a land that was already inhabited by other people, so they were walking into a whole bunch of conflict and challenges, things that would test their faith in ways they probably didn't even expect.
So it wasn't just a matter of showing up and saying, okay, this is ours now.
Yeah.
There were still a lot of battles ahead,
Yeah.
both physical and spiritual.
Exactly. And that's where the real lessons of Jericho come in. The Israelites had just seen with their own eyes how God could help them overcome impossible things. But the question is, would they continue to trust in God's power when faced with new challenges? Would they keep following God's commands even when they didn't make sense?
It's a question that keeps coming up again and again in the book of Joshua and throughout the Old Testament. Their journey had some amazing victories, but also some pretty tough defeats. Sometimes they had incredible faith, and other times they were filled with doubt and disobedience.
Their story reminds us that faith isn't just a one-time thing or some kind of magic solution. It's about trusting in God every step of the way, even when things are hard, even when we don't understand his plan, and even when we make mistakes.
Yeah, it's like they had this crazy experience at Jericho. They saw proof of God's power with their own eyes, but then they still had to keep choosing to believe, to trust, and to obey in every new situation.
Absolutely. And that's something we all struggle with, right? We might have times where we feel God's presence or see him working in incredible ways. But then life throws us a curveball and we start to doubt, we get scared, or we just want to do things our own way.
So how can we take the lessons of Jericho and apply them to our everyday struggles, those walls that seem to be blocking us from what we really want? Is it just about trying harder to be obedient, to have more faith?
Well, I think it's about more than that. True victory comes from surrendering to God's will, not from trying to do everything in our own power. It's about letting go of our fears, our worries, and the need to control everything.
Yeah.
It's about letting God work in us and through us.
Kind of like those Israelites marching around Jericho. They weren't fighting in the normal way. They were just following God's instructions, trusting that he would take care of the rest.
Exactly. It was an act of pure obedience, showing that they were completely relying on God. And that's the kind of faith we're called to have, not a passive or naive faith, but an active faith that chooses to trust in God's power, even when it doesn't seem to make sense.
And what about this idea of spiritual warfare? How does that fit into the challenges we face?
Well, think of the walls of Jericho as a metaphor. They represent the things that hold us back. Our fears, negative thoughts, maybe addictions or bad relationships. When we talk about spiritual warfare, it's about recognizing that there are unseen forces at work. Forces that can affect our thoughts, feelings, and actions.
So it's not just about fighting our own battles. There's something bigger going on.
Exactly. And just like the Israelites needed God's help to overcome those physical walls at Jericho, we need his help to break free from the things that are holding us captive spiritually.
Okay, so how do we get that help? What are the weapons we can use in this spiritual battle?
Well, if you look at the Apostle Paul's letter to the Ephesians, he talks about putting on the armor of God. Things like truth, righteousness, faith, peace, salvation, and the Word of God. These are the tools that help us stand strong against the attacks of the enemy, to see the truth when we're surrounded by lies, and to walk in freedom and victory.
I like that image of putting on armor. Like we're not fighting alone. We have a God who's fighting for us.
Yeah.
And he gives us everything we need to overcome any challenge.
And that brings us back to the heart of the Jericho story. God always keeps his promises. He promised to lead the Israelites to the promised land. And he did, even though it wasn't easy. He promised to be with them every step of the way. And he was, even when they messed up.
God's still working in our lives today, even when we don't see it, even when it feels like we're just going in circles.
And just like he had a plan for the Israelites, he's got a plan for each of us. A plan that might be tough at times, but it leads to a life full of purpose, meaning, and so much more.
This deep dive has been incredible. We've gone from talking about a battle to exploring these deep truths about faith, obedience, redemption, and spiritual warfare.
I hope it's challenged all of us to look at the walls in our own lives and to really see if we're trying to fight battles on our own when we could be asking God for help.
So as we wrap up, I want you to think about what you've heard today, what stood out to you. What are those marching orders that you might be missing? Where do you need to let go and trust that God can break down any wall that's in your way?
And remember, you're not alone in this. God's right here with you, ready to guide you, strengthen you, and give you the power to win.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep searching, keep asking questions, and keep looking for the truth.